Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about Jack Kerouac's 1962 novel, Big Sur. And this book is set in the year 1960. It takes place over the course of 3 months in the year 1960. And as far as Jack Kerouac's life goes in the retelling of his life through novels, this is the last book, timeline-wise, in the story of him retelling his life story through his novels. He did publish several books after this book, but as far as his life, this is the final book that he wrote in the telling of his life story. And I will say that Big Sur really represents the culmination of the On the Road story. On the Road being the very beginning of his life on the road, and the Dharma Bums being the middle of it, and then Big Sur being the very end of that time period. And one way I feel that Big Sur really represents the culmination of that story is that if you look at On the Road, in On the Road he has his very first ride hitchhiking. And in Big Sur, it talks about his very last time hitchhiking. And in On the Road, he gets a ride very easy. He really has an easy time hitchhiking. He goes from ride to ride to ride, going across the country. But in Big Sur, he's on the West Coast in California, and he really struggles to get a ride. It takes him hours and hours and hours to get someone to pick him up. And he talks about how all the cars that are passing him, they're full of tourists, this family's on vacation, and it's really not the America that Jack Kerouac was hitchhiking in in the late 1940s during the events of On the Road. America has really changed since then. This idea of the American family road trip vacation has really taken off at this point, and the life that he had traveling in years past has pretty much gone away at this point. And at this point in his life, he's very jaded by the fame of On the Road. And the main focus of this book is that he goes to Big Sur, California, as a kind of a retreat to get away from the fame, all the attention. He has a friend who has a cabin at Big Sur that he goes to stay there as a retreat to get away from the fame, because he talks about how he's very sick of all of the interviews and appearing on TV. He's become this huge celebrity in America, and he's trying to get away from that at this point in his life. And from what Jack Kerouac describes in his book, you can see that he really regrets what he created. He regrets this counterculture movement that he kind of kick-started with the publication of On the Road. And he describes how, at this point in his life, people still think he's this 26-year-old guy hitchhiking across America, but instead he's this 40-year-old alcoholic who's very depressed and isn't the same person that he was in the events of On the Road. And people still think that he's that person. And all these young people in America are trying to recreate this person who Jack Kerouac was, trying to live like him. And this is not who he was anymore. And he really feels that doesn't really represent the spirit of what he did. And you can just see that he really regrets what has become of this movement that he started. At this point in Jack Kerouac's life, he is deep into the life of being an alcoholic. It describes in vivid detail what his life is like being an alcoholic, all the difficulties go along with that. And it's quite depressing hearing him describe about all these binges he goes on and how he regrets it afterwards, and just what it's like being an alcoholic. And you can see that he really uses alcohol as a coping mechanism at this point in his life. Because there's one part early on in this book where he gets news from his mother. His mom sends him a letter saying that his pet cat died, and he just spirals into this deep depression because of that. And his only idea of what to do is just go out and get drunk, and he goes out and just drinks for several days because he's just so depressed that his cat died. And you can really see how alcohol has become a coping mechanism for him at this point in his life. Another interesting part in this book is at one point he's staying at this cabin at Big Sur with a group of friends, and some of these friends, maybe they're other friends. And at one point most of the group leaves the cabin, goes into San Francisco for a while, and he's stuck there at the cabin. And one of the people in this group decides to stay back in the cabin with Kerouac, and he's this young guy. He's a very big fan of Jack Kerouac, and Jack's just kind of stuck there with this huge fan of him at this cabin, and he just despises this kid. This kid wants to just talk to Kerouac about everything, and just really trying to, he wants to recreate this on the road, lifestyle with Jack Kerouac, and he wants to go out hitchhiking with him. And you can see Kerouac wants nothing to do with this guy. I think that really represents the change that has happened with the beat movement, because most of the beats, they lived through the 1930s, 1940s, and they really went through hard times. And they all their writing, they talked about how they tried to find good things in life. They tried to really find adventure, I think, as a way to cope with all these difficulties he went through. And these young people in America now who are trying to recreate this lifestyle that Jack Kerouac lived, they're very young. They were born after World War II. It's just a very different generation. They didn't live through the same events as Jack Kerouac. You really see that. You really see how, it's a different generation at this point who's taken up this counterculture lifestyle, and Jack Kerouac just does not relate at all to these people. And I think my favorite part about this book is how it describes how Jack's relationship with Neal Cassady has changed at this point. Neal Cassady is in this book. He appears as the character's name is Cody in this book, and you can see how the relationship is very strained at this point. It's not the same relationship that it was during the events of On the Road, where they're both traveling together. You can see they've both kind of grown apart at this point. And Neal, in this story, he's described as being a kind of like a family man at this point. He has his own family, he has kids, he's married. It really describes him as being, a very well put together person, as well as he could be at this point. I mean, I know his life, after the events that take place in the book are very chaotic, and I wouldn't really call him a family man with what happens later in his life. But as far as this book describes it, you can see how it kind of portrays him as having his life pretty much put together at this point. And that's really the opposite of how the book On the Road ends. Because in On the Road, when it ends, you see that Kerouac kind of has his life somewhat put together. He kind of, he's very different than Neal. Neal is kind of still just traveling this bum, just hitchhiking around America. And it's just very different from how Jack Kerouac's portrayed at the end of On the Road. And in Big Sur, you can see it's the opposite, where Neal has his life put together. He's a family man, but Kerouac is an alcoholic, still hasn't quite figured out what he's doing with his life. And I mean, he's a famous published author at this point, but he still just hasn't figured it out. And it really portrays how their relationship has shifted, where they're the opposite of what they were On the Road at this point. And towards the middle of this book, Neal Cassady sets Jack Kerouac up with a mistress of his. He kind of dumps him at her apartment and leaves the two together for a while. He feels like they'll be a good fit for each other. And at first they kind of hit it off, and it seems like they're going to really get along. They talk about getting married. But at the same time, I feel like Kerouac's character in this book kind of just starts falling apart, where, this woman that he's staying with, she goes to work every day. He just kind of sits at her apartment and drinks wine all day, just gets drunk, sits in this chair, and he just waits for her to come home. And you can kind of see how there's really nothing to Jack Kerouac anymore. His life is just him drinking. He doesn't do really anything at all anymore except drink. And it describes how he sits in this chair and just drinks all day. And this chair that he's sitting in, he's sat in it for so long over the course of many weeks that he's staying with this woman. The chair is starting to fall apart. The bottom's starting to fall out of it because you just spent so much time sitting in it. I think this broken chair really represents how Jack Kerouac himself is a broken man. And in this chair that he's spending all this time sitting in, there's a fishbowl next to him where there's this goldfish that lives in the fishbowl. And he talks about how he's feeding the goldfish cornflakes, and he's constantly smoking next to the goldfish and just really not taking care of the fish and creating a really bad environment for the fish. And the fish dies. And the dead goldfish really triggers Jack Kerouac the same way the dead cat triggers him. At another point in this book, he sees a dead mouse that also triggers him. So he gets very triggered by death. Death is definitely a reoccurring theme in this book, where he just cannot cope with anything dying, whether it be an animal or anything. And I would say the dead goldfish is really the point in this book where things really begin to go downhill as far as the story goes. As far as his life, he really just begins to lose it. And he's constantly talking about how he thinks everyone's out to get him. He constantly thinks that he's dying, which, I mean, from a certain point of view, he is. He's an alcoholic. He's slowly killing himself by drinking. So, this idea he has that he's dying is not really that far from the truth. So you can see why he has this fear of death, because he's slowly killing himself, and I think he's afraid of that. And as the book goes on, his life continues to spiral and spiral and spiral downhill. He goes with this woman to the cabin, Big Sur, with a couple other people, and the entire trip is just a complete disaster. Him and this woman are not getting along at this point. You just wonder, what is he doing with this woman? And the book continues to spiral, and you're wondering, how is this book gonna end? And then on the very last page of the book, he kind of just wakes up after being drunk and having this terrible night, it basically says, I got it all figured out, and he goes back home to the East Coast. It's very strange. Like, I feel like he's at the lowest point almost in his life, and then he just, okay, I got it figured out, and goes back home. It's very strange the way the book ends. And I think that really represents Jack Kerouac's life, because he's constantly running away from his problems. I think that that's what that represents. He just, okay, I got it figured out, I'm going to go leave. I'm going to leave all this behind, and I got to figure it out now. And he really doesn't have it figured out. He just keeps doing that. He keeps just running away from all of his problems. And that's the same reason why he drinks alcohol, as a way of covering up all of these negative things he feels in his life, just as a way to run away from all of his feelings and emotions. Because I feel like after reading this book, when I think back on all the other Jack Kerouac books I read, every time he goes somewhere, he always tends to have problems, the places that he goes. He's always causing problems or running into problems. And he just kind of runs away from that. He just doesn't feel comfortable wherever he goes. And I think that's why he travels so much, because the only time he feels comfortable is when he's leaving something behind or going to something new. He just never feels himself when he's stable and living in the same place for a long period of time. But getting back to the book itself, I feel like this book is definitely one of his best written books. I feel like at this point in his writing career, he's really developed his style. I mean, every book he writes is very different, but I think this book is a very good combination of his stream of consciousness writing and also a very good narrative. I feel like it's very well written as far as the sentence structure and the way he describes things. It's very easy to read, and it flows very well. And his descriptions of nature in this book are very, very vivid and descriptive. His descriptions of the sea and the nature around Big Sur are just very well written. I think it really reminds me of a lot of transcendentalist writing, the way they describe nature. I feel like he incorporates a lot of those vivid descriptions into his writing, which I really like. And at the very end of this book, it has his poem he wrote about Big Sur. It's called Sea, and basically what he did is this poem is inspired by the sounds of the ocean. He sat by the ocean at Big Sur and just let the sounds of the waves and the wind write this poem for him. And it's a very strange poem. I don't really enjoy the poem at the end. It's doesn't really make sense, which I think is kind of the point. Just taking the sounds of the ocean and using that to write random thoughts and turn that into a poem. And in the book, in the actual story itself, it talks about when he went and wrote that poem. So it's cool to hear about him in the story writing the poem, and then at the very end you get the actual poem that he wrote, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, that's Big Sur by Jack Kerouac. It's definitely, like I said, one of his best books. If you read On the Road, I think you have to read Big Sur. It's really the culmination of that story. And I like how in Big Sur it's really reflective of the rest of his writing. Like, he's talking about his thoughts on the book On the Road. I think it's really cool how he writes about his life, and then you see the process of him writing about his life in his books that he writes. So that's kind of cool, and I think Big Sur is a good example of that. So yeah, that's Big Sur by Jack Kerouac. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next book review.